Okay, let's unpack this because, well, it's a bit of a head scratcher, isn't it?
It really is.
You see these huge companies, the ones we think of as paragons of success, really well managed, ticking all the
Doing
boxes.
everything right, supposedly.
Exactly. And then suddenly a new technology pops up or the market shifts and they just stumble. Sometimes they even fail completely.
Right.
How does that happen?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's something Clayton Christensen tackled head-on in The Innovator's Dilemma, which is the focus of our deep dive today.
Right, The Innovator's Dilemma. Great title. It really hints at the problem.
It does, because his core argument is actually quite counterintuitive.
Yeah, he says the very things that make a company great, listening to your best customers, focusing on profit, investing smartly,
All the good management practices.
those can actually be the reason they fail when something truly disruptive comes along. It's not about bad management. It's this, like, built-in conflict.
Spot on. And that's what we want to get under the skin of today. We're going to explore this dilemma, look at the mechanics behind it, and see how it plays out in different industries across different times.
Because this isn't just some historical footnote, right? You can see these same dynamics playing out now.
Absolutely. It's incredibly relevant.
So whether you're leading a business, part of a team, or just, fascinated by how industries evolve, understanding this can be a real eye-opener.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's dive in. What's the absolute core idea we need to grab onto first?
Well, it really hinges on this key distinction Christensen makes between sustaining innovations and disruptive technologies.
Okay, sustaining versus disruptive.
Right. So established, well-run companies, they're usually brilliant at sustaining innovations.
And that means?
Think incremental improvements, making existing products better for their current customers. Faster processors, clearer screens, more fuel efficiency, that kind of thing.
Got it. The upgrades we expect. Like my phone getting a slightly better camera each year. You're giving your current customers more of what they already value.
Precisely.
Hmm.
And focusing on that makes perfect sense for these companies. It leads to predictable growth, plays to their strengths, and keeps their most profitable customers happy.
Seems logical, so where's the trap?
The trap springs when disruptive technologies show up.
Okay, so what makes a technology disruptive in this context? How is it different?
Well, the key thing is when disruptive technologies first appear, they often actually underperform compared to existing products in the mainstream market, at least on the metrics those mainstream customers care about.
So they look worse initially.
Kind of, yeah. They might be simpler, maybe cheaper, smaller, more convenient in some other way. And crucially, they often appeal to a completely different set of customers, maybe a new market segment or one that the big players weren't really serving.
Can you give an example?
Sure, think about the first personal computers compared to mainframes. Way less powerful, right? But they appeal to individuals, a totally new market. Or early digital cameras. The picture quality wasn't great compared to film.
But you could see the picture instantly? No waiting, no developing costs?
Exactly. Different attributes valued by a different group.
Okay, so these disruptive things, they're not immediately attractive to the big, successful companies
Not usually, no.
because their main customers, the profitable ones, don't want them, at least not at first. And maybe the profit margins are lower too?
Often, yes.
Oh.
Much lower sometimes. So you're a manager in this big company, you look at this new thing and you think, my best customers don't want it, it performs worse on their key metrics, and I'll make less money on it.
Yeah, why would you chase that? It sounds like a bad business decision.
And that's the absolute core of the dilemma. Rational managers making logical choices based on their data, their incentives, their customers' current demands. They naturally prioritize the sustaining stuff. The improvements that promise immediate, solid returns.
So ignoring the disruptive tech seems like the smart play. In the short term, anyway.
Right. But Christensen's insight is that by doing the right thing for their current business, they leave the door wide open for newcomers. New companies can embrace that disruptive tech, serve those overlooked niche markets.
And then maybe improve the technology over time and eventually challenge the big guys.
That's often the pattern. It's like you're so busy perfecting your surfboard for the waves. You don't even notice the tide is changing and a whole new kind of wave is coming.
Wow. Okay. So where did Christensen find the proof for this? What evidence did he dig into?
A huge part of his research, really the bedrock for the book, was an incredibly detailed study of the hard disk drive industry.
Hard disk drives. That seems very specific.
It was perfect, actually, because that industry saw constant, rapid technological change over decades. You had tons of sustaining improvements, more capacity, faster speeds.
Stuff the big computer makers wanted.
Exactly. But you also had these periodic disruptive shifts, Primarily, the physical size of the drives kept shrinking, from 14-inch platters down to 8-inch, then 5.25-inch, 3.5-inch, and even smaller.
And each smaller size enabled new types of computers, right? Mini computers, then desktops, then laptops.
Precisely. And here's the kicker. Christensen tracked the companies using data, mainly from a publication called Disk Trend Report, and he found this relentless pattern.
Which was?
The established leaders in one generation of drive size, say, the dominant makers of 14-inch drives, almost universally failed to lead in the next disruptive generation, the 8-inch drives. Then the 8-inch leaders mostly missed the boat on 5.25-inch drives and so on.
So it wasn't just one or two companies messing up, it was systematic.
Over and over again. Leadership was constantly overturned not by gradual shifts, but by these disruptive jumps to smaller formats, usually pioneered by new entrants.
Okay, but why? Did the big companies just not see the new technology coming? Were they asleep at the wheel?
That's the fascinating part. No, not really. Christensen found that the established companies often were aware of the new technologies. They frequently even developed prototypes of the smaller drives in their own labs.
So they had the tech. Then what was the problem?
The problem was organizational. It was about resource allocation. Their processes, their sales channels, their major customers, everyone was geared towards serving the existing high-end market, like mainframes or mini computers, that demanded bigger, higher performance, higher margin drives.
So the sales team would go to their big customers and ask, do you want this smaller, slower, lower capacity drive? And the customer would say,
No thanks. Give me more megabytes on the 14-inch. So the requests coming back up the chain reinforced the focus on sustaining improvements for the current market. The smaller drives just couldn't get traction internally because they didn't fit the established model or meet the perceived needs of the most important customers.
it's like having the ingredients for a pizza, but only ever making burgers because that's what sells best right now.
That's a good analogy. The attributes valued were completely different. For mainframes, it was raw capacity and speed. For the emerging mini-computer market needing 8-inch drives, size and power consumption started to matter more. Then for desktops needing 5.25-inch drives, low cost became absolutely critical. Different markets, different values.
Which brings us nicely to this concept you mentioned, value networks. What exactly is that?
Right, the value network is basically the whole context a company operates in. It's not just the customers, but also the suppliers, distributors, the competitors. And crucially, the specific way that value is defined and measured in that particular market.
So different markets have different value networks.
Absolutely. Think mainframe computers versus early personal computers. Completely different ecosystems, different suppliers, different customer expectations about performance, price, support, everything.
And a company gets sort of locked into its primary value network.
It does. Your position in that network shapes your perception of what's important, what's valuable, what's an attractive opportunity. A technology or product feature that's highly valued in one network might be irrelevant or even undesirable in another.
So the mainframe disk drive maker, embedded in that high-performance, high-margin value network, they look at a cheap, small, low-capacity drive for a PC and just don't see the potential.
Exactly. Their network isn't asking for it. The metrics they track, gross margins, performance benchmarks relevant to mainframes, make that PC drive look like a terrible proposition. The cost structures are different too. Mainframe suppliers needed high margins to fund big R&D and direct sales forces. The PC market required super high volume, low-cost manufacturing. Different worlds.
So it always looks more attractive for these established companies to move upmarket, right? Offer even better performance, more features to their existing high-end customers who'll pay for it.
Precisely. That upward pull is incredibly strong. It promises higher margins, leverages existing capabilities, and fits perfectly within their established value network and cost structure. That path seems logical, profitable, and, frankly, less risky.
Compared to moving down market into this messy, uncertain, low-margin, disruptive space.
Which looks financially unattractive and strategically questionable from the perspective of the existing business. Why chase tiny margins in a market you don't understand when you can make good money serving the customers you know?
And it's not just the CEOs making these calls, is it? You mentioned middle managers play a role too.
A huge role, often. Think about it. If you're a middle manager in a successful company, how do you get promoted?
By delivering results, hitting targets, championing successful projects.
Right. And what kinds of projects look like winners? Usually the ones targeting large existing markets with clear customer needs and high potential revenue, essentially, the sustaining innovations.
Okay, that makes sense.
Proposing a project for a disruptive technology often means dealing with a small, uncertain market, low initial margins, maybe cannibalizing existing sales. It looks way riskier for your career. There's a higher chance it might fail by the company's current metrics.
So even if top leadership says we should innovate, the internal systems and incentives can subtly steer resources back towards the tried and true sustaining path.
Exactly. It creates this inertia, this bias against the disruptive, even if people are smart and well-intentioned.
Okay, so we've got the customer focus, the pull of the value network, the incentives.
Mhm.
What about the company's internal capabilities? How can their strengths actually become weaknesses?
This is where Christensen introduces the Resources, Processes, Values framework, or RPV. It's a really useful way to think about what a company can and cannot do.
RPV, resources, processes, values.
Resources are the obvious things.
Yeah.
People, cash, technology, brands, relationships, stuff you can hire, buy, or build.
Right. But processes and values are different.
Yes. Processes are how work gets done. The established routines, the communication patterns, the manufacturing methods, the market research techniques, how products are developed, the ingrained ways of working together.
The systems.
Exactly. And values are the criteria the company uses to make decisions and set priorities. What kind of orders get priority, which customers are most important, what level of gross margin is acceptable, what's the required market size for a new venture.
So resources, how things get done, and what the company prioritizes.
Right. And the crucial point is that while resources are flexible, processes and values often aren't. They get honed over time to be really efficient and effective for the current business model and value network.
Ah, so they become optimized for the status quo.
Precisely. And that optimization, that strength in the current market, becomes a disability when faced with a disruption that requires fundamentally different processes or is judged by different values.
How so? Give me an example.
Well, think about market research processes. A company might be fantastic at surveying its existing customers about features they want on the next generation product. But those same processes might be completely useless for understanding a potential market for a disruptive product that doesn't exist yet, where the customers aren't clearly defined.
Like trying to forecast the market for the very first PCs.
Exactly. Christensen points out how market research firms like DiskTrend were pretty good at forecasting sustaining developments in disk drives, but consistently underestimated the growth of the new markets opened up by the disruptive smaller drives. The established processes just weren't built for that kind of uncertainty.
And the company's values screen out the disruption, too.
Often, yes. If a company's values dictate that any new venture must achieve, say, 40% gross margins and target a billion-dollar market within 3 years, a disruptive opportunity that starts small with maybe 20% margins just won't get approved. It doesn't fit the criteria for success.
Even if it could grow into something huge later.
Even then, the initial numbers don't pass the established hurdles.
You mentioned HP's Kitty Hawk drive earlier. Tiny little drive, technically amazing, but it didn't take off. How does RPV explain that?
Well, HP had the resources, clearly. Amazing tech. But the intended market early handheld devices, PDAs, didn't materialize as quickly or in the way they expected. Their processes for forecasting and market development were likely tuned to their bigger, more predictable computer and printer markets. And the values probably prioritized larger, surer bets. So when the Kitty Hawk market proved small and uncertain, it likely struggled to compete for resources and attention against HP's established, profitable businesses. It was a great resource, but the processes and values perhaps weren't aligned for that specific disruptive context.
So it's not just about inventing the new thing. The whole organization has to be able to nurture it.
That's the key. The organizational context matters immensely.
Okay, so it sounds really hard for established companies. Did any manage to navigate these disruptions successfully? Are there positive examples?
Yes, definitely. And comparing successes and failures is really instructive.
Okay, like what?
Well, think about DEC Digital Equipment Corporation, a mini computer giant. They famously struggled to get into the personal computer market effectively. They tried to manage it within their existing structures.
Which were geared for high-margin mini-computers.
Right. Now contrast that with IBM and their original PC.
Right.
What did they do?
Didn't they set up a completely separate unit down in Florida, kind of away from the main corporate bureaucracy?
Exactly. An autonomous unit. It had freedom to use different components, like off-the-shelf parts, different development processes, different sales channels, like retail stores, and crucially, a different cost structure and different values suited to the fast-moving, lower-margin PC market.
So creating that separation was key. It let them build the right processes and values for the new market without being dragged down by the old ones.
That's the argument. We see a similar thing in retail. Credge successfully launched Kmart by creating a separate discount store organization. Dayton-Hudson did something similar with Target.
And Woolworth.
Woolworth tried to launch its Woolco discount chain, but kept it too closely tied to the parent variety store company. The old company's profit formulas and operating procedures got imposed, and Woolco ultimately failed. It couldn't develop the right independent processes and values.
Interesting. What about outside the U.S.? Any examples?
Honda's entry into the North American motorcycle market is a classic case. They didn't initially go head-to-head with Harley-Davidson and the big British bikes.
No, they came in with those small, cheap, reliable 50cc Super Cubs, right? Stuff the established players weren't interested in.
Precisely. They targeted a whole new value network, people who wanted simple, reliable, easy-to-use transportation, not necessarily big, loud cruising machines. They found a foothold in that overlooked market.
And then they gradually moved upmarket, offering bigger and bigger bikes.
Yes, once they had the distribution, the brand, and the manufacturing scale. Contrast that with Harley-Davidson, who initially struggled when they tried to respond with smaller bikes. Why?
Their dealers, maybe. The dealers were used to selling big, high-margin bikes.
Exactly. The existing dealer network, part of Harley's established value network, wasn't set up or incentivized to sell and service small, low-margin bikes effectively. The existing structure resisted the disruptive product.
It sounds like sometimes the first attempt at a disruptive market might not work, but the company can survive and try again.
That's a really important point. There's a difference between the failure of an idea and the failure of the firm.
Okay.
Look at Intel. They initially struggled with microprocessors. The market wasn't clear. But they were able to pivot, find the right applications, and eventually dominate. Honda's initial U.S. strategy for large bikes didn't quite work, so they pivoted to the successful small bike strategy. They learned and adapted without betting the whole farm on the first try.
But with something like HP's Kitty Hawk, maybe they put too many resources into one specific vision of the market that didn't pan out.
Possibly. If you make a massive, irreversible bet on a specific disruptive application before the market is validated and it fails, that can be fatal, which leads to thinking about better strategies.
Right. So if you're an established company facing potential disruption, what should you do? How do you manage this dilemma?
Well, one approach Christensen advocates is discovery-driven planning for these uncertain markets.
Discovery-driven planning.
Yeah, instead of writing detailed business plans based on shaky forecasts about markets that don't exist yet.
Which we know are often wrong for disruptive tech.
Exactly. You instead focus on identifying the key assumptions underlying the business idea, what has to be true for this to work. Then you design low-cost experiments to test those assumptions in the real world as quickly and cheaply as possible. Learn and adapt based on the results.
So it's more iterative, more experimental, less about grand plans, more about learning your way into the market.
Precisely. And we already touched on another key strategy, creating small autonomous organizations, setting up a separate unit or even a spin-off.
Like IBM did with the PC.
Right. You need an organization whose size and cost structure match the opportunity. A small team can get excited about a $10 million market that would be a rounding error for a $10 billion corporation. It needs its own processes, its own values, aligned with the specific challenges of the disruptive market.
You mentioned controlled data doing this with disk drives.
Yeah, they were a mainframe company, but when the 5.25-inch drive opportunity emerged, they set up a dedicated, largely independent operation in Oklahoma City, far from their Minnesota headquarters, to pursue it. That unit could operate with the speed and cost structure needed for the PC market.
What about just buying the disruptive company? Acquisition.
That can work too, sometimes. If you acquire a small, innovative company that's already making inroads with the disruption, like Allen Bradley, a traditional industrial controls company, acquiring Modicon, an early leader in programmable logic controllers, which disrupted the old relay-based systems. But you have to be careful not to just smother the acquisition with the parent company's processes and values.
Right, integrate it carefully or let it run somewhat independently.
Yes, and finding those initial markets, those beachheads, is critical, even if they seem small or niche at first.
Like Honda finding people who just wanted simple transport.
Exactly. You need some customers who value the unique attributes of the disruptive technology today, even if it's not the mainstream. That gives you a place to start, learn, and improve.
So overall, it's about recognizing the disruption, having strategies to experiment and learn, and creating the right organizational context, maybe separate units to actually pursue it.
That sums it up well. Aligning the organization with the specific strategic challenge of the disruption.
Okay, there's another concept you mentioned earlier, performance oversupply. How does that fit into this picture?
Right, performance oversupply. This relates to how products evolve over their life cycle.
How so?
Well, think about how companies compete. Early on, it might be all about raw functionality, just making the thing work.
Yeah.
Then maybe reliability becomes key, then convenience or ease of use, and eventually, often, price becomes a major battleground.
Okay, the basis of competition changes.
Exactly. Now, performance oversupply happens when established companies, in their race to satisfy the most demanding customers in their existing market, keep improving performance on certain dimensions beyond what the majority of the mainstream market actually needs or values anymore.
So the product becomes, like, too good, more capable than most people require.
In a way, yes. Customers reach a point of saturation on certain features or performance levels. They might say, yeah, it's faster, but the old one was fast enough for me. Or, it has more features, but I never use them.
And that creates an opening.
A huge opening. Because it means customers might now be receptive to a disruptive product that is perhaps simpler, cheaper, or more convenient, even if it underperforms on those traditional metrics where there's now an oversupply.
Because good enough on those old metrics is now truly good enough for many people.
Right. And they might value this simplicity or cost savings more. Christensen uses Intuit's QuickBooks as an example.
The accounting software.
Yeah. Traditional accounting software was complex, built around double-entry bookkeeping, which accountants needed. But for many small businesses, especially with computers handling the math, that complexity was overkill. QuickBooks offered something much simpler, easier to use, maybe less powerful by traditional accounting standards.
But perfect for a small business owner who just needed to track income and expenses.
Exactly. It capitalized on the performance oversupply and complexity from the established players and offered a disruptive simplicity that resonated with a huge market.
That makes a lot of sense. So, bringing this to the present day, you mentioned electric vehicles. How does the Innovator's Dilemma framework help us think about EVs and the traditional auto industry?
Well, you can definitely see the patterns. For decades, established automakers focused on improving gasoline engines, transmissions, making cars incrementally better within that known value network.
Where things like horsepower, engine refinement, and especially driving range and quick refueling were key metrics.
Right. Then EVs come along. Initially, what were the knocks against them?
Limited range, long recharge times, high cost.
Exactly. They underperformed on the key metrics valued by the mainstream car buyer in the established value network.
Yeah.
And the refueling infrastructure wasn't there. So for a long time, many major automakers looked at EVs and thought, the market isn't ready, or the technology isn't good enough, or the margins aren't there. It looked like a niche, maybe even a distraction.
Classic disruptive technology characteristics.
Very much so. And initially, EVs found traction in specific niches, maybe with environmentally conscious early adopters or tech enthusiasts or people using them as second cars for short commutes where range wasn't a major issue.
Those beachhead markets.
Right. The challenge for the incumbents is, or was, how seriously to take this disruption when it didn't fit their existing models or meet their current customers' primary demands. Do you invest heavily? Do you create separate EV units? How do you manage the transition without damaging your incredibly profitable legacy business?
It's the dilemma playing out in real time on a massive scale.
It really is.
Yeah.
And you see different companies taking different approaches with varying degrees of urgency and success so far.
Fascinating. So let's try and wrap this up. It really comes back to this core tension, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
The very management practices, the focus, the capabilities that lead to success in the current market can actively prevent a company from seeing and seizing the next wave of innovation.
That's the heart of it. The innovator's dilemma is this powerful, almost gravitational force. It's driven by that rational focus on current customers and profits, reinforced by value networks, and solidified by organizational processes and values that are perfectly adapted for yesterday's market.
So for anyone listening, the key takeaways seem to be really understand the value network you operate in, but also be aware of potential new ones. Critically examine your own organization's processes and values. Where are they enabling you, and where might they be blinding you?
And learn to recognize disruptive technologies for what they are, often initially underwhelming, low-margin, targeting niche markets, but with the potential to reshape the entire landscape over time.
It's not just about having the tech crystal ball, is it? It's about building organizational flexibility, being willing to experiment, maybe even setting up those separate ventures.
Absolutely. It demands strategic foresight, but also organizational humility and adaptability, a willingness to nurture the small, the uncertain, the different.
This has been incredibly insightful. It really reframes how you think about business success and failure and innovation itself.
It's a powerful lens, definitely.
So here's a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. Think about an industry you know, well, maybe the one you work in or one you follow closely. Can you spot any potential disruptions lurking on the horizon? They might look small or insignificant now.
Maybe even a bit clumsy or underpowered.
Right. And based on what we've discussed, how do you think the established leaders in that industry are likely reacting? Are they investigating, ignoring? Are their internal processes and values likely to help or hinder them if that disruption takes off?
It's a great exercise. Applying these ideas,
Because understanding the innovator's dilemma at the end of the day isn't just about dodging failure.
no, it's also about seeing the future. It's about recognizing where the next wave of opportunity might come from and figuring out how to